I told them, look, and this is, I firmly believe what I'm doing is for the best of my people, because I told them, look, if they're not harming you right now, it just means your time has not come. I mean, they have a strategy, they have, a plan. They're going to destroy all of us. And believe me, I'm trying to do my best to save all of you. But I'm not going to stand silent and watch, the Chinese government wipe out my people just to save my family. Because at the end of the day, after they wipe out my people, they're going to do the same thing to my family. So, yeah.
Episode of the Macquarie University Liberal Club Sunday Sessions. I'm your host, Rory O'Connor, and I'm joined by my co-host, Andrew Kremen. Andrew, how are you?
I'm good, Rory. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too, legend. Tonight we are joined by Salih Hudayar, who I found here is a Uyghur American politician known for advocating for East Turkmenistan independence. He founded the East Turkmenistan National Awakening Movement and has since been leading the movement calling for the restoration of East Turkistan's independence. On November the 11th, 2019, Hudayar was elected the Prime Minister of the self-proclaimed East Turkistan Government-in-Exile. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
No worries. I'll just let our audience know that you can drop comments down below. We are live, so hopefully we'll be able to get them towards the end. So we'll start with our first question. Tell us about East Turkestan. Where is it? What's its history, and what is currently going on there?
East Turkestan is currently occupied by China. Back in December 22nd, 1949, the then newly established People's Republic of China, with the help of the Soviet Union, invaded and occupied East Turkestan. The Chinese government refers to East Turkestan as the so-called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. It's been the homeland of Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and other Turkic peoples for over nearly, some historians say, about 6,000 years. The name Turkestan in itself signifies the Turkic peoples of this area, including the Uyghurs, who are the majority. What the current location, East Turkestan is roughly about 1/5 of the territory of what is now known as the People's Republic of China, or what is claimed as the People's Republic of China. It's roughly about 1,828,418 square kilometers. So a huge piece of real estate, which is strategically located, being, the crossroads of East and West, connecting Central Asia to East Asia, and serving as essentially, historically, it used to be like a buffer zone between China and Central Asia and South Asia. In fact, it wasn't until it was in 1876, during the great power competition of the time, known as the Great Game, for Central Asia, that the then British Empire, feeling that the Russian Empire, which was in Central Asia, was going to further expand, and if it expanded south, it would have expanded into East Turkestan, creating, a border situation with the British Empire in India, and hence the British Empire at that time funded the Qing dynasty, the Manchu Qing dynasty, to invade and occupy East Turkestan through the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. And then in 1884 is when East Turkestan was first formally incorporated into the Manchu Qing Empire as Xinjiang, meaning the new territory or the colony at that time. During the early 20th century, the people of East Turkestan rebelled initially against the Manchu Qing dynasty. Then, after the Manchu Qing dynasty fell, with the rise of nationalism and national movements across the world, the people of East Turkestan declared their independence in 1933 as the East Turkestan Republic. This first republic was tacitly supported by the British, and the Soviets assisted the Chinese nationalists to overthrow it, fearing that it would spread into West Turkestan, or what is now the present-day countries of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and so forth. And then in 1944, we declared independence once more. This time, the Soviet Union actually initially backed it a bit to secure Outer Mongolia's independence from China. So it was a strategic game where the Soviet Union essentially used East Turkestan as a pawn to achieve further strategic objectives. Then in 1946, the Soviets stopped supporting East Turkestan, and we maintained the status quo until 1949, when the Chinese Communists invaded. Prior to the invasion of the Chinese Communists, the Soviet Union, they invited all of our top leaders for a high-level meeting, and then the official narrative is that their plane crashed and that they all died. And months later, the People's Republic of China marched in, and without effectively really putting up much of a fight, the remaining leadership pretty much signed away our, independence and, quote, agreed to be a part of China or the PRC. Though many military officials of our military at that time refused and actually waged, in many ways like a guerrilla warfare type of resistance for the next decade until they were all captured and killed.
That's genuinely awful. I've actually got a background from an African country where the leader was was overseas, and then the Marxists moved in that time, and then it took 50 years to get rid of that government. It's an awful story. Thank you for telling us about that. So tell us about the Uyghur Muslims and what's happening to them in Xinjiang.
So the Uyghurs are an ethnically Turkic and Indo-European people. We're actually a hybrid of both Indo-European and Turkic. So our features are, range from some, look almost European, some look, Asian. The Uyghurs have been inhabiting East Turkestan according to, archaeological and geological studies and genetic studies, have been inhabiting East Turkestan for about 6,000 years or possibly even more. They are, throughout history, they've created numerous, empires and states and kingdoms in East Turkestan and Central Asia. They've practiced various religions from, originally from, shamanism or Tangrism to Nestorian Christianity to Zoroastrianism and Buddhism, and then starting in the 10th century, late 10th century, Islam. Though Islam didn't become the dominant religion until after the 14th and 15th century. It was after the occupation of East Turkestan in 1949, the Chinese government at that time, according to various sources, according to our own government sources, documents that we gave to the U.S. Consulate in Urumqi in 1947, our population at that time was about 8 million. According to Mao in 1949, after he took over East Turkestan, there was about 9 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic peoples. Then moving on, the Chinese government began to shift the demographics, began implementing a long-term colonization policy to where today the Chinese population went from less than 179,000 in 1949 to over roughly 10 million, over 8 million, or even 10 million if you include the security forces in East Turkestan. Excuse me. It was only after 9/11 that the Chinese government began to use the excuse of so-called counterterrorism, taking advantage of the fact that majority of Uyghurs are, identify as Muslims, and they practice Islam, to taint and to misportray the East Turkestan, independence movement, the broad movement for East Turkestan's independence, as the so-called East Turkestan Islamic movement. And starting in November of 2001, the Chinese government has always been claiming that they're fighting against the so-called East Turkestan Islamic movement, which did not exist prior to that. There is no mention, whether it's in Chinese government documents or any other government documents, about such an entity. And so they fabricated this and said that this is what we're fighting against. And gradually they began to, restrict Uyghur culture, identity over this, made up entity. It was only in 2014, with the rise of Xi Jinping as the, the dictator, sole dictator of China, or the chairman of the Communist Party, that China began to implement its, essentially the precursor of its final solution to the East Turkestan problem. Then they began to target Uyghurs, initially young men between the ages of 15 and 45, on the excuse that they were prone to become radicalized, or that they were going to resist the state, and started sending them into so-called counter-extremism centers, which later became known as re-education camps or vocational training centers. Starting in 2017, this expanded to the entire population of Turkic population of East Turkestan, including Uyghurs, both men and women, especially anyone who had either traveled overseas or who had any contact with with anyone overseas. And according to, it wasn't until 2018 that the international community began to understand what was happening. And at that time, the initial estimate was about 1 million to 1.8 million people locked up in concentration camps. Then in 2019, in May, the U.S. Department of Defense came out and estimated that, the first entity to call it concentration camps, and they estimated that some 3 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic peoples were being held in these so-called re-education concentration camps.
Well, the next question then was, can you tell us a little bit about your background? What was the journey you took to where you are now?
Yes, I was born in East Turkestan, in the city of Atush, which is real close to Kashgar, but borders Kyrgyzstan, or which is a small country, another ethnically Turkic country, to a Uyghur business family. Our experience with the Chinese government, historically, our family background, we've always been either termed as counter-revolutionary or capitalist or separatist by the Chinese government. My great-grandfather, who I was named after, was executed in 1952 following the Chinese communist takeover of East Turkestan, simply because he owned a lot of wealth. I had other relatives in my family, including great uncles, who were arrested for being a counter-revolutionary activist or counter-revolutionary separatist, and so forth. It was in 1997 when I had my first encounter with the Chinese government. At that time, I was 4. This was months after the 1997 Gulja massacre, in which hundreds of Uyghurs were killed by the Chinese security forces following peaceful demonstrations, advocating, calling for an end to Chinese colonization and other atrocities in East Turkestan. At that time, there was a lot of people across East Turkestan who became very hopeful about the potential for our independence, given that the Soviet Union had fallen, and that gave birth to the independence of former West Turkestan, the present-day countries of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and so forth. And my uncle, who was only 17 at the time, he was caught reading a book, a political book that the Chinese government has banned. And one of our neighbors ratted him out. And because of that, he was arrested. Then they came, into our home in the middle of the night trying to search for this book and to get my uncle to confess to his crimes and being part of XYZ organization. Ultimately, they woke everyone up, and that's when they pointed their rifles at each of our heads, including mine, threatening to kill us if my uncle did not confess to his crimes. So essentially, my great grandmother, who was alive at the time, she just told my uncle, my father had fled East Turkestan in the mid 90s because of the political activism he was doing. And they said, my great grandmother said, just tell them what they want to hear. This, he's a trust left to us from your brother. Just tell him what you want to hear. And so my uncle ended up spending, years in prison for, something that for simply reading a book, actually. This was in 1997. My father ended up coming to the United States in late 1997. He had fled East Turkestan in the mid 90s and ended up in the US. And it was only in 2000 that we were able to come to the US as political refugees. I grew up in Oklahoma. I had a, childhood dream to be a military officer, and to one day, liberate my homeland. Unfortunately, my career didn't, extend too long, despite joining, studying ROTC Reserve Officer Training Corps and being a member of the Oklahoma Army National Guard. I had there were some medical problems that came up, and my military career, ended shortly within like 2 years. So I decided to study, politics as another way to help my people. And it was in 2016 that I began to, find a way how to take advantage of the growing situation, like take advantage of the interest of the international community on China, and specifically how we could use that to highlight our case. This is when the camps were happening as well, and while many existing groups focused on the human rights aspects, I felt that we need to focus on the political aspect as well, because essentially without political rights, you're not going to be able to guarantee your human rights and so forth. And so I founded Etnam with like-minded Uyghurs and Kazakhs who grew up here in the United States like myself, and we to advocate for both the political and human rights of East Turkestan and its people. We actually were the ones who put forth the Uyghur Policy Act. We were the first ones to call for recognition of genocide, for recognizing East Turkestan as the occupied country, and seeing my success with Etnam, our government-in-exile, which has been around since 2004. They initially, they asked me to be their representative to the United States. And so I took that position, then becoming very popular. I became, suddenly very popular amongst our diaspora community. And so our diaspora community members, they, wanted me to, lead our movement, especially the cause to restore East Turkestan. And so in November 12th of 2019, at the 8th General Assembly of our Government-in-Exiles, where we have elections every 4 years, where the parliament, local representatives from local diaspora communities elect their parliamentary members, and then those parliamentary members end up electing a leadership. And so I was elected as the prime minister of the government in exile. And this was something that both our diaspora community wanted, because they wanted more young faces, especially those who grew up in the West and would be able to better, represent our cause into the international community.
Yeah, I noticed that we were actually born in the same year. It's very impressive to become prime minister at your age. It really is. If I might ask, you've mentioned your encounters with the Chinese growing up. What does the CCP think of the work that you currently do in government? What have been the repercussions for the government?
So in 2019, when we released, so we were the first organization then under Etnam to release the coordinates of the concentration camps in East Turkestan. We released in 2018 about 500 coordinates of these concentration camps and satellite imagery, because prior to that, many people, they heard about the camps, but they couldn't physically, they couldn't visibly see it. So we collected data and were able to push that forward. The Chinese Foreign Ministry, they tried to call us, a terrorist organization. Actually, they did. They didn't try. They did call us a terrorist organization, saying that overseas, U.S.-based, terrorist groups, publish this data. This is nonsense. This doesn't exist. So forth. Even throughout the years, the Chinese government, we brought up a case against them at the International Criminal Court through the government in exile and the National Awakening Movement. And even after that, they, used the same terminology to describe us as, separatists and terrorists and so forth. And this is something that we reject. We don't, espouse terrorism or anything violent. We're trying to regain our independence through established international laws, through peaceful means and so forth. I've been constantly harassed, whether it's online, intimidated. The Chinese government even had some of their agents here or assets here in the United States try to infiltrate our organization, or try to get close to us. Some even try to test me to see if I would even sell, offering me, oh, how much would it cost to buy you off? These types of things. Obviously, they realize that I'm not someone for sale. And in that instance, they threatened me to, stop what I was doing, threatening my family, both here and especially those inside East Turkestan. I remember one of these agents that, I had this encounter with, specifically, telling me to stop pushing for independence, stop, doing this, because if and saying that if I don't care about myself, at least think about your family, think about those back home. And shortly after that, shortly after we filed our ICC case, well, prior to us filing our ICC case, I got word that some of my relatives, four of my relatives, were killed within the course of like several months in 2019, in prison, two in prison, two in the camps. And I even had relatives in Central Asia calling me, telling me, just stop what you're doing. You're harming us over here, even the ones in Central Asia, outside of East Turkestan. And I told them, look, and this is, I firmly believe what I'm doing is for the best of my people, because I told them, look, if they're not harming you right now, it just means your time has not come. I mean, they have a strategy, they have, a plan. They're going to destroy all of us. And believe me, I'm trying to do my best to save all of you. But I'm not going to stand silent and watch, the Chinese government wipe out my people just to save my family, because at the end of the day, after they wipe out my people, they're going to do the same thing to my family. So yeah.
I think there's a lot of stories regarding the interference of the CCP that I think the average Australian, knowing some of the things that do go on, there's just so much that we don't fully realize the sacrifices that people make to even get some of this information out. Thank you for sharing this. It's extraordinary stuff. As you've mentioned, you're seeking independence. I mentioned the country my family's from. It took 50 years that to happen there, and given historically, how long does it take to kick out the communists from your country? It takes longer than 50 years normally. So, what do you think realistically would need to happen?
Realistically, for one, the international community needs to, acknowledge what's happening in East Turkestan. They need to acknowledge the situation of East Turkestan. For example, when you hear about our neighboring country, Tibet, everyone around the world, they know about Tibet. They know Tibet is not a part of China. They know Tibet was invaded by China and occupied by it. Some governments, including, the United States, officially recognize Tibet as an occupied country. And the Chinese government, they call Tibet Xinjiang, just like they call East Turkestan Xinjiang. On our issue, the Tibetans have a Dalai Lama, and that's how they were, more attractive. And the fact that, when they fled, they immediately created a government in exile back in 1959. Whereas for us, it was only in 2004 before we were able to convince any government to actually allow us to, create a government in exile in their country. So we are far, behind in terms of that. But one recognition, even if it's just acknowledging that this cause exists, is the first the first step. The fact that Uyghurs are different, the fact that East Turkestan existed historically. If you look at maps prior to the 20th century, it all says East Turkestan, whether it's British maps, Chinese maps, Japanese maps, Russian maps, American maps. This country existed before. So this is something that we need to acknowledge. We need to acknowledge that colonialism has not ended in the 21st century. Many people, think that, after the independence of the various African countries in Africa and some countries in Asia, with the process of decolonization, that colonialism has ended. But colonialism is happening right now in the 21st century. It's happening in East Turkestan. It's happening in Tibet, in southern Mongolia. So this needs to be, recognized. And the international framework, for example, the 1960 UN Convention on the Declaration of Granting Independence to Colonized Peoples and Nations, needs to be implemented regarding, East Turkestan and Tibet, and by, and the other territories that are seeking independence, or other colonized territories under Chinese occupation. I think that's the very first step that needs to happen. And getting back to your question that it might take a long while, we don't have a whole lot of time. And when I mean the Uyghurs, if this genocide continues for another 10 years, we will, the situation will be irreversible, to the point that China will have finally reached its objective of, forever keeping East Turkestan as a part of China. And I'm hopeful that with the international community, being more aware of the situation and the changing, geopolitical climate, that the world will be more supportive. And the fact that, understanding the Chinese, the threat that the People's Republic of China and the CCP poses to the international community. 30, 40 years ago, when our people were warning about this to the international community, many people, thought we were crazy, that, this will never happen, that China will, once the Western world, invests in China and does business with China, that China would become more democratic and more like the West. But the past 30, 40 years has shown us that the West has become more like China, and the West has become more undemocratic, like China. It's been, the reverse. This is something that's dangerous, but a lot of people are waking up to this, so this is a good thing. And lastly, like, China is just an empire, like the Soviet Union. It's an empire. Every empire has a time. It doesn't last forever. It has, a certain lifespan. And who would believe that in 1989 or 1988 that the Soviet Union would fall in 1991? Not many people. And we are hopeful that the same thing will happen, with the People's Republic of China. And they are fearful of this. They know that they might fall, and this is why they are trying to undertake this final solution, in terms of eradicating the Uyghur and other Turkic peoples, to preempt a possibility of independence in the future. But we're hopeful that we will regain our independence with the support of the free world, and mostly with the fact that justice and truth is on our side.
So you've mentioned that one of the things that would help would be the international community recognizing the situation that's happening in East Turkestan. At the current moment, what support and help have you received? I think you mentioned, did America pass a bill that you were advocating for? So what work has been done? Who has actually recognized support?
So in 2018, well, we started in 2017, but we were able to convince the U.S. Congress to put forth a Uyghur Policy Act in 2018, albeit it was a bit weaker than what we had initially, proposed. However, by late 2020, we were able to get parliaments across the world. The first parliament was the Parliament of Canada, to recognize China's atrocities against the Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples as genocide. And this was shortly followed after, by a few months later, by the United States, the US government officially coming out and designating it as a genocide as well. And that essentially created somewhat of a domino effect, to where most of the some of the countries in Europe, like the UK, Belgium, Netherlands, France, the Czech Republic, Lithuania, and so forth, recognize China's atrocities as a genocide as well. We're actually trying to do the same thing in Australia. We've been trying to campaign for Australia to recognize the genocide as well, because I think that's the very first step that needs to be taken. Address the current atrocities that are happening. Then, while addressing that, also focus on why it's happening. Everybody says, "Oh, okay, this is happening, but why is it happening?" This is where the historical aspect is important. The fact that this is an occupied country. This is a country that China invaded and occupied and is colonizing, and this is something that could very well happen beyond East Turkestan. If China gets away with this in East Turkestan, it's going to want to do the same thing in Tibet. After it finishes Tibet, it might want to do the same thing in other parts of the world, or it might want to expand further into Central Asia, into South Asia. They're already in doing this in a more covert way through their Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially a plan for global domination, and many people don't understand that.
The original pro-life movement, after the Roe v. Wade decision in the US, totaled about 30 people. Since then, it's become one of the largest human rights movements of our time. Do you expect such an exponential increase in support for East Turkestan and independence?
Well, so as more and more people are aware about our cause, I feel that there will be hope, especially given the Ukrainian situation, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the fact that that when people are aware of this, people all across the world will support this. You have people from various parts of the world, even going to volunteer to fight against the Russian invasion, to fight for the liberation of Ukraine. So we're hopeful that if the world is truly aware, if they are, if there's enough awareness about the situation in East Turkestan, if they are aware that colonialism and genocide is taking place in the 21st century, they will support it. And like, for example, for us, this is where I see some similarities or connections between, like, for example, the Jewish people and us. The Jewish people, they faced the Holocaust, and even when they faced the Holocaust, not many people were, at that time, many countries knew about it, but they were silent. The same way it is, happening in East Turkestan today. But at the end of the day, what guaranteed the safety and security of Jewish people in the future? What guaranteed their existence? The fact that they were able to establish the state of Israel. That's what's able to protect their human rights. That's what's able to protect their political rights. Even in our sense, we feel that without our own country, without our own independent state, there is no way that we are going to be safe or secure, or we are going to be even able to exist in the future if China continues its campaign of occupation and colonization.
We've got a few audience questions here. One says, what are the solutions to stop the concentration camps, and what can the West do politically to stop China doing these abuses?
So one, you see the Ukrainian issue here, and I'm like, there are so many things that are happening, over Ukraine, that I'm saying, why is the same not being done on the issue of East Turkestan? Every year you have global leaders, organizations, politicians all vowing never again. In Holocaust Remembrance Day, they all hashtag never again. And then you have many countries like the US, many parliaments in Europe who have recognized it as a genocide, but have not done anything beyond that. If you recognize it as a genocide, then there needs to be, repercussions. You have, a treaty obligation under the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Which means you have to punish those perpetrating this genocide, or you have to prevent this genocide from happening. And what needs to be happened is, the same type of things that is happening, via Russia to Russia. There needs to be sanctions, not just, in sanctions of specific Chinese leaders, but there needs to be sanctions of the entire Chinese economy. There needs to be boycotts by, these by people all across the world, by governments. There needs to be, diplomatic demarches, diplomatic repercussions, like dismissing or expelling Chinese diplomats, especially Chinese diplomats who are denying this genocide, and saying that, we're not engaging in genocide. This is so-called counterterrorism or so forth. Everything that's happening, to Russia needs to be applied to China in this sense. For example, we have a case against China at the International Criminal Court. The ICC, they said they're going to probe Russia over the Ukrainian invasion, yet the ICC has been silent for the past 2 years on our complaint, stating that they don't have enough evidence. Initially, then after we gave them that evidence, they said we're considering it, and there needs to. This is what's happening to why the ICC is taking investigation Russia, is the fact that there is enough international pressure, enough international attention, and that's what needs to happen on our end. We need to have international attention. The U.S. and other members of the UN Security Council needs to bring this issue, the East Turkestan issue, to the agenda of the UN Security Council. Even though China will veto it, just the fact that they brought it to the attention of the UN Security Council will make waves.
Do you think other countries in the world are scared of China, and that's why there hasn't been as much of a support in this scenario in comparison to, say, for example, with Russia?
Yes, it's because they're worried about their economic relations. China, unfortunately, because of the previous things that I mentioned earlier, like for example, the West being and the global community being a bit, you know, foolish in their relationship with China. It's become, a monster to where it has been integrated into the international global economy to where it plays a very significant role in that. They have a lot of political and economic influence in virtually every country. They've managed to, unlike the Soviet Union, because everybody has been, very cautious about that. The world wasn't so cautious about China, and using that, China has been able to infiltrate, governments, parliaments, organizations all across the world, and swaying them towards, you know, upholding China's so-called core interests. And so this is essentially what's happening. The world is just feels that they have a lot to lose if they push back against China, while at the same time, I'd say it's weak leadership is what's playing as well. Is playing a part of this is the fact that there's weak leadership and there's no real defined strategy. The U.S., the West had a strategy against the Soviet Union, but there's no strategy, in terms of how to deal with China. There hasn't been, an effective coalition to push back.
I wonder personally how intentional that is. That there is no strategy. It's something I've been wondering for quite some time. We've got another audience question here. Saying it says, "Hello, Mr. Prime Minister. My question is: if Han Chinese living in East Turkestan helped in the liberty of East Turkestan, and they have lived there for generations and participated a lot economically and socially, would East Turkestan, as a sovereignty, recognize their citizenship and treat them equally as the rest of minority groups?"
Yes, I think if they've contributed to the liberation of East Turkestan, we'd be very inclusive. Even back in the 1940s, for example, you had there wasn't just Uyghurs, despite the fact that it's called East Turkestan because majority of the population are Turkic, but you had Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, Tatars, Mongols, and even Shibe, the Manchus, that were initially sent back in the 1800s to occupy East Turkestan for the Manchu Empire. Even they fought alongside the East Turkestan Republic against the Chinese nationalists or the Republic of China to liberate it from to liberate East Turkestan. So yes, in that aspect, if they are contributing to to the liberation of East Turkestan from colonialism, from genocide, from occupation, we will treat them all equally.
I've noticed that in your constitution as well. I was having a read of it, and it was mentioning the official religion will be Islam, but any other religion is of course welcome. Their rights will be respected. If I can ask a question here, the Epoch Times sponsor Shenyang Performing Arts, which is a classical Chinese dance, and is performed today to keep alive Chinese culture that existed prior to the communist takeover. Your constitution features poetry written prior to that time as well, and I think some of the politicians who have been involved in the government in exile have also been poets. Have you considered a similar path for East Turkestan to keep the culture alive and communicate that to the world?
Yes, we've had many cultural events, and poetry is a big thing. Music is another big thing in our culture, and like we have something that was called meshrep before the Chinese government cracked down. It's like a societal gathering, like village, like people in your village or on like the village level, they will gather and all come together, and the village elders, whatever problems there is, they will make people talk to one another and address these issues. Of course, it's not just limited to that. There was also music, dance, teaching the younger generation some more cultural aspects, more historical cultural aspects of our culture. The Chinese government obviously saw this as a threat because in the 90s, this Meshrab movement, prior to that, we had a very bad problem within our community in East Turkestan, especially amongst the youth, the rise in, alcoholism and drugs, and so forth. So the Meshrab movement essentially helped push back against that, and, led to decreases use in drugs and alcohol amongst our youth. And this, instead, they projected, they introduced football, created various football teams across East Turkestan to keep the youth, the energetic youth, distracted through sports and other means. And the Chinese government, this is essentially what led to the Gulja massacre. They shut down, these Meshrab events. They executed 30 the Uyghur activists who, while they advocated for independence, they felt that we had to address the societal problems within our community before we could achieve, these other goals. So this is why they focused on, this campaign to target, to eliminate drugs and alcohol and other things that were detrimental to the improvement of our society. And so you had these Uyghurs being executed, the Meshrab being cracked down, and then the people took to the streets to protest this in February of 1997. But the Chinese government, like it always has, used excessive force and brutally crushed the demonstrations.
I am aware of the time, and I know we're coming towards the end. We only have about 3 minutes left. For university students, if they wanted to get involved and if they wanted to support the movement for East Turkestan, what could they do personally?
So the first thing that they can do is obviously to spread awareness, hold more events like this. Whether it's using social media to create awareness and reach out to their members of elected officials to create legislation to address these issues. Secondly, if they have time to, volunteer, even with now we're living in a 21st century, so people can, volunteer remotely, to help, create more awareness and, to write more research on this issue.
If I might ask another question also, so in regard to, the concentration camps, the sort of that are going on over there, there are various, you've got clandestine organ trades that are happening in that area as well. And there are all kinds of stories that are coming out regarding it. Do you know what's being done internationally to address this organ trade? Because surely so overt and evil would be quickly addressed. You'd think so anyway.
Internationally, I mean, you had the China Tribunal, but it's not really an international. It's like an independent body that came out to highlight this. There are international laws against, just like it's against forced trafficking. There's, laws against, these types of things, like not specifically saying, organ transplants, but things like organ transplants. But China has many ways to evade this, just like, they are evading to evade international law. China seems to be, violating international law, almost every aspect of it, but still getting away with it because, again, governments, there's not really one, unified entity that can uphold and, ensure or implement international law to make sure that it's implemented. To it's all up to individual governments to, make sure that these implementations are being happening. And because of China's, political and economic clout, they're just too, hesitant at the time being to really take action.
Well, I believe we're now out of time. I'd like to thank you, Prime Minister Salih Hudayar, for coming on to our show. I know it's now 1:30 over where you are, 1:30 in the morning. So thank you so much for coming on to Sunday Sessions.
Thank you for having me.
Right, this has been Sunday Sessions hosted by the Macquarie University Liberal Club. My name is Andrew Cummin and my co-host Rory O'Connor. We will see you next week. Goodbye.